We are still in Act 1, Scene 1, and we have got to the point then where there's been the fight in the street, and we have Romeo then turning up, and something's wrong with him. And Montague and Lady Montague say to Benvolio, "Will you find out what's wrong with him?" And Benvolio says, "Yep, go away, so I can speak to him, and I'll find out what the problem is." Now, as you can see on the screen, this is the original text. This is my own Mr. Bruff modern translation. This is how my ebook is laid out. So um, Benvolio says, "Good morrow, cousin," meaning good morning, cousin. And Romeo replies with the question, "Is the day so young?" So he's saying, "Is it still so early as to be morning?" Which suggests that he's um, two things. It suggests that he's not thinking very rationally. He's not on top of the situation, and he's kind of um, disquieted. But also it suggests that his day is very laborious and stretching out before him, which is linking to his sadness. And Benvolio explains, "But news struck 9." So in other words, it's only just gone 9 in the morning. To which Romeo says, "Ay me, sad hours seem long. Was that my father that went hence so fast?" So in other words, when you're sad, time goes very slowly. And that links in with Einstein's theory of relativity. Obviously, Einstein came after this, but Einstein said that time is relative, and that if you put your finger over a candle for a second, it'll feel like an hour. But if you spend an hour in the presence of a beautiful woman, it'll feel like a second. And Romeo is experiencing that, the theory of relativity here, because he's saying, when you're sad, time seems to stretch on forever. And then he says, "Was that my dad who ran off?" Benvolio is honest. He says it was. So yes, it was your dad. And he asks, what sadness lengthens Romeo's hours? In other words, what is making you sad? To which Romeo replies, "Not having that which having makes them short." So in other words, I'm sad because I don't have something that, if I had it, would make me happy. So Benvolio says, "Are you in love?" In love? And Romeo says, "Out." Um, and Benvolio asks, "Of love? Do you mean you're out of love?" And Romeo replies, "Out of her favour, where I am in love." So in other words, there's a woman who I love, and she doesn't love me back. Now this is quite interesting because Montague has just explained to Benvolio that he can't work out what is wrong with Romeo, that he's asked Romeo, he's tried everything he can, he's got friends to ask Romeo, and Romeo won't explain. And yet here Romeo just tells the truth to Benvolio, and that suggests that Benvolio is a character he feels very trustworthy of and safe with. And he explains, all of his sadness and all of his unhappiness is because he's in love with a woman who doesn't love him. So Benvolio says, "Alas, that love so gentle in his view should be so tyrannous and rough in proof." And what that means is that isn't it sad that love, which is so simple a thing, or it seems so simple, looks so simple, is actually so difficult and rough when you fall in it, when you're in love. Now, just to explain, and what I'm going to do in the videos today and from now on is I'm going to translate the whole scene and then go back and analyse, just because I think that'll help with understanding, the whole context of the scene. So if you're thinking, where's the analysis, just hold out for a few minutes. So Romeo says, "Alas, that love, whose view is muffled still, should without eyes see pathways to his will." So in other words, he's saying it's really sad that love, which is supposed to be blind, love is blind, we hear, because that's that suggestion that you can fall in love with anybody, can make you do whatever it likes. So he's saying love is actually a very vicious taskmaster. And then he changes subject, and he says, "Where shall we dine? Oh me, what fray was here?" So he says, "Where are we going to eat?" And then we get the idea that perhaps he's looking at Benvolio and has noticed Benvolio's got like a cut or um, some blood on him or something, and says, "Oh, what fight has this been? You've been in a fight. Yet tell me not, for I have heard it all. Here's much to do with hate, but more with love." So he said, "You know what? Don't even tell me about it. I've heard it all before." Um, the battle between the Montagues and the Capulets yes, they hate each other, but the love is mixed in with it, which is quite a bizarre statement to make. And then we have this very complex bit that Romeo says, which is this very sort of uh, overtly romantic imagery that he goes into. Why then, O brawling love, O loving hate, O anything of nothing first create, O heavy lightness, serious vanity, misshapen chaos of well-seeming forms, feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick health, still waking sleep that is not what it is, this love feel I that feel no love in this, dost thou not laugh? So here we have a series of kind of oxymorons, things that are opposites and don't go together. But basically, what he's saying is that hate is filled with love, love is filled with hate, love comes from nothing, depressing happiness, serious stupidity, beautiful things mixed up in chaos, light and heavy, hot and cold, sick and well, being awake and still being asleep. That's not what love is. I feel love, but no one loves me. So he's kind of saying that, true love is not this chaos of emotion. And then it finishes with, dost thou not laugh? Are you laughing at me? To Benvolio. So I think Benvolio um, perhaps senses here that Romeo is being really over dramatic and soppy, and is clearly, you know, fantastically head over heels in love. And Benvolio says, no, cause I rather weep. So in other words, no, cause I'm not laughing, I'm crying. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. And Romeo says, good heart, at what? So, good man, what are you crying about? To which Benvolio replies, at thy heart's great oppression. So he's saying, I'm crying because you're so sad. And I think that wakes Romeo up, because he then says, why, such is love's transgression. Griefs of mine own lie heavy in my breast, which thou wilt propagate to have it pressed. With more of thine, this love thou hast shown doth add more grief to too much of mine own. So in other words, he's saying, that is what love is like. I am really unhappy, and you're making me more unhappiness because you're making me more unhappy because you're unhappy. It's because you love me, because you're showing me this love and this sympathy, it makes me even sadder. And that's what love is like. Love is constantly mixed up with unhappiness. And then Romeo goes into another kind of very over-the-top, dramatic, romantic piece. Love is a smoke raised with the fume of sighs, being purged a fire sparkling in lovers' eyes, being vexed a sea nourished with lovers' tears. What is it else? A madness most discreet. So in other words, what he's saying is love is like smoke made up of unhappy sighs. It's like a fire which burns in your eyes. It's like unhappiness, and you can fill a whole sea with tears. What else is love? It's madness most intelligent. A choking gall and a preserving sweet. So it's like a sweet which you choke on. Farewell, my coz. In other words, goodbye, cousin. So Romeo makes this big kind of conclusion that love is, such an unhappy and chaotic thing, and then says, look, I'm going. But Benvolio says, soft, I will go along, and if you leave me, so you do me wrong. In other words, I'll come with you, and don't leave me, because that would be unfair. So Romeo says, tut, I have lost myself, I am not here. This is not Romeo, he's some other where. So in other words, I'm lost inside, I've lost myself, that this isn't the real me, he is somewhere else. And Benvolio says, tell me in sadness, who is it that you love? So, tell me honestly, who do you love? And Romeo says, what, shall I groan and tell you? Um, shall I groan while I tell you? If you wanted the honest and serious truth, you want me to tell you in a really serious tone? Benvolio says, groan, why no, but sadly tell me who. So he said, no, I don't want you to groan, just tell me, who is it? And Romeo says, bid a sick man in sadness make his will. Ah, word ill, urged to one that is so ill. In sadness, cousin, I do love a woman. So in other words, he's saying, if you tell a sick man to make a will, that isn't going to help the situation. It's just going to make it worse, because you're going to make him think that he's going to die. And you're doing the same to me. If you ask me who I love, you're making it worse, because I'm upset because of who I love. But I do love a woman. And Benvolio, and this is obviously a little bit of a joke, isn't it? Benvolio says, I aimed so near when I supposed you loved. So in other words, I guessed that already. And Romeo says, a right good markman, and she's fair that I love. So he's saying, well, you guessed well, and she is beautiful. And Benvolio says, a right fair mark, fair cuz, is soonest hit. So that means, we're talking about the kind of imagery of Cupid's arrow here, and Cupid, sort of, when he hits people with this arrow, they fall in love. And Benvolio is saying, well, beautiful women fall in love very quickly. But Romeo says, well, in that hit you miss. She'll not be hit with Cupid's arrow. She hath Dian's wit, and in strong proof of chastity well armed. So he's saying, well, now you're wrong. You've missed it now. You've got it wrong, because she doesn't want to fall in love. She's very clever. Diane has a link to chastity, so she doesn't want to have sex. She'll not sleep with me. From love's weak childish bow she lives unharmed. She will not stay the siege of loving terms, nor bide the encounter of assailing eyes, nor ope her lap to saint seducing gold. Oh, she is rich in beauty, only poor, that when she dies with beauty, dies with her store. Now, what does this mean? Well, I'm going to analyse this in closer detail in a second, but what it actually means in terms of the translation is that she isn't impressed by my childish love for her. She won't listen to me. She won't even let me look at her. She won't have sex with me. She's beautiful, but not very rich. And the sadness is that her beauty is going to die with her, because she's not going to have, children if she never has sex with anyone, and therefore her beauty will not be passed on to her children. So, it's really sad. Benvolio says, then sorry, I'm stumbling on my Shakespeare today. Then she hath sworn that she will still live chaste. In other words, has she taken an oath to remain a virgin, to keep her chastity? And Romeo says she has. And in that, sparing makes huge waste, for beauty starved with her severity cuts beauty off from all posterity. She is too fair, too wise, wisely too fair, to merit bliss by making me despair. She hath forsworn to love, and in that vow do I live dead, that live to tell it now. So he's saying, yes, she has. She's taken a vow never to sleep with anyone, which is a huge waste because she's so beautiful, and she'll never have children. She's too pretty, too clever, too amazing, to make a vow to never fall in love. And because of it, I am dead inside. So, if she's not going to love anyone, then I'm dead inside. It kills me. Benvolio says, be ruled by me, forget to think of her. In other words, let me tell you what to do, just forget about her. And Romeo says, oh, teach me how I should forget to think. So he's willing. He says, yeah, sure, show me. How do I forget? How can I forget this woman? And then there's a clever idea here. By giving liberty unto those eyes, examine other beauties. In other words, well, let yourself look at other women and you'll forget her. But Romeo isn't having any of it. He says, 'tis the way to call hers exquisite. In question more, these happy masks that kiss fair ladies' brows, being black, put us in mind, they hide the fair. He that is struck and blind cannot forget the precious treasure of his eyesight lost. In other words, if I look at other women, it's just going to make me realise how beautiful this one is. If you go blind, you don't forget what it was like to see. In other words, just because I look at other women, I'm not going to forget what this woman looks like. Show me a mistress that is passing fair. What doth her beauty serve but as a note where I may read who passed that passing fair? Farewell, thou canst not teach me to forget. So he's saying, if you show me a pretty woman, her beauty is like me reading a letter, which just tells me where to find the real beauty. So goodbye, I'm going. And Benvolio says, I will pay that doctrine or else die in debt. In other words, I will achieve what I wanted to achieve here. I will make you forget this woman, even if I have to go to the grave, even if I have to die, having never achieved it. And that is the end of Act 1, Scene 1. So, it's a very long scene, Act 1, Scene 1. Obviously, it has to establish the setting and all the characters and lots of different things going on. But this last part here is where we first meet Romeo. Obviously, we haven't yet met Juliet. And it's interesting to note that the woman that Romeo is talking about is not Juliet, it's a different woman, Rosaline. So we're going to do a little bit of Romeo character analysis now, and I'm going to just run through some ideas which are written out into full and detailed paragraphs in my ebook, but I'll sort of summarize the idea here. So we we read about Romeo, or we hear about Romeo before we actually meet him as a character. So we hear that um, from Benvolio that he has been running off and hiding in the woods. And we hear from his mum and dad that he has been crying and locking himself in his bedroom. And this gives us an idea of Romeo that perhaps he's very introverted and shy. He's clearly very unhappy about something, but he seems to be a very quiet and shy character. So, thinking back to Samson and Gregory from the beginning of the scene, Samson and Gregory, as explained in the ebook, give us a very sexualized view of love. In other words, the message that they portray is that love is sex. And we might expect from Romeo that we're going to see something different because he seems to be, very kind of introspective and very serious and emotional. So we might think, okay, now we're going to meet Romeo, we're going to see a different view of love. So we get to meet Romeo, and to begin with, his words do tie in with a very romantic view of love, um, which matches the romantic poetry of the Elizabethan era. So in Shakespeare's time, romantic poetry often focused on the negative effects of love upon a man. And we see some very dramatic language from Romeo. We see sad hours seem long. He mentions some mythological, classical references of Cupid and Diana. He has these kind of strong images of love is a smoke made with the fume of sighs, and all of this kind of very sort of over emotional language. So it starts to make us think, okay, well, here's a guy who is seriously in love. He's not just about the sort of sexual banter, and he seems to believe in romance, and yet it changes because we eventually realise the reason that Romeo is upset is because Rosalind will not ope her legs to saint seducing gold. Now, what that means is, ope her lap. Now, what that means is that he is upset because she will not open her legs to him. He's the saint seducing gold, and have sex with him. So he's not upset for any other reason than this woman will not sleep with him. And this is quite shocking. The imagery here is very, very rude and sexual. Lap refers to a woman's genital area. Saint seducing gold refers to a man's genital area. There are two different ways of interpreting it, but you could say that Romeo here is calling his own genitalia saint seducing gold. In other words, something so amazing that it would seduce a saint. A holy saint would be seduced if they saw it. So it really is, shockingly, just like the bawdy banter and kind of innuendo from Samson and Gregory at the beginning of the scene.